In 1920, a psychologist took a happy 9-month-old baby and deliberately traumatized him. He conditioned the child to fear everything furry animals, white beards, even cotton. The experiment destroyed the baby's life, and the psychologist never reversed it. This is the Little Albert experiment. Johns Hopkins University, 1920. Psychologist John B. Watson had a theory: all human emotions are learned, not inherited. Fear, not natural. It's conditioned. To prove it, he needed a test subject. Someone young enough to have no prior fears. Someone he could control completely. He chose a 9-month-old baby named Albert. Be healthy, calm, emotionally stable. Watson described him as stolid and unemotional. Albert's mother worked at the hospital as a wet nurse. She was likely poor, vulnerable, and Watson offered her money. She agreed. Watson's plan was simple but cruel. Take a baby who fears nothing and teach him to fear everything. First, Watson tested Albert's baseline reactions. He showed him a white rat, a rabbit, a dog, a monkey, cotton wool, and burning newspapers. Albert reached for all of them. Curious, unafraid, he even tried to play with the rat. Perfect. Then Watson introduced the conditioning. Every time Albert touched the white rat, Watson struck a steel bar with a hammer right behind the baby's head. A deafening, terrifying sound. Albert screamed, cried, fell forward. Watson did it again, and again, and again. After 7 pairings, Albert saw the rat and immediately started crying. He'd crawl away, trying to escape. Watson had successfully traumatized a baby. But Watson didn't stop there. He wanted to see how far the fear would spread. This is called generalization, when a conditioned fear transfers to similar objects. He brought out a rabbit. Albert had loved rabbits before. Now, he screamed and tried to get away. A dog, same reaction, terror. A fur coat. Albert cried and crawled backward. A Santa Claus mask with a white beard. Hysterical crying. Even cotton wool soft, harmless cotton made Albert whimper and turn away. Watson had conditioned a 9-month-old baby to fear anything white and furry. The fear wasn't rational. It was visceral, automatic, overwhelming. Watson documented everything: photographs, film footage, detailed notes. He published the results as proof that all emotions are learned. But here's what makes this experiment truly horrifying. Watson planned to reverse the conditioning. He promised to eliminate Albert's fears before the experiment ended. He never did. Albert's mother removed him from the hospital when he was about 13 months old. Watson lost access to the child. He later claimed he didn't have time to reverse the conditioning. Others suspect the mother realized what was happening and fled. Either way, Watson published his findings and moved on. Little Albert was left with trauma Watson had deliberately created. For decades, no one knew what happened to Albert. Watson never followed up, never checked if the fears persisted, never tried to help. In 2012, researchers claimed to identify Albert as Douglas Merritt, a boy who died at age 6 from hydrocephalus. If true, Watson had experimented on a neurologically impaired child, which made the experiment even more unethical. Other researchers disputed this, suggesting Albert was actually William Barger, who lived to 2007 and had a lifelong fear of dogs and other animals. We may never know for certain, but either way, Watson's experiment left lasting psychological damage on a child who couldn't consent, couldn't understand, and couldn't escape. The Little Albert experiment became one of the most famous studies in psychology. It's taught in every introductory psychology course as proof of classical conditioning. But it's also one of the most unethical experiments ever conducted. Watson violated every principle we now consider basic research ethics: no informed consent. Albert's mother likely didn't understand what Watson was doing. No right to withdraw. Once the experiment started, Albert couldn't leave. Deliberate psychological harm. Watson intentionally traumatized a baby. No debriefing or reversal. Watson never undid the damage he caused. Today, this experiment would be immediately shut down. Watson would lose his license. He'd face criminal charges. But in 1920, there were no ethics boards, no regulations, no oversight. Watson did whatever he wanted, and he became famous for it. The experiment launched his career. He's remembered as a pioneer of behaviorism, the idea that all behavior is learned through conditioning. That legacy is built on the suffering of a child who never had a choice. The Little Albert experiment taught us something important about fear and conditioning. Phobias aren't always rational. They're often learned through traumatic associations. A child bitten by a dog might develop a lifelong fear of all dogs. Someone in a car accident might panic every time they drive. These aren't weaknesses, they're conditioned responses. Understanding this helped create treatments like exposure therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy, which help people unlearn their fears. But the experiment also taught us something darker. Scientists can abuse their power. Watson had complete control over a vulnerable child. He used that power to cause harm, and he faced no consequences. This experiment is why we have ethics boards today, why researchers must get informed consent, why vulnerable populations, children, prisoners, people with disabilities have extra protections. The rules exist because of experiments like this. Little Albert's suffering wasn't meaningless. Forced psychology to confront its capacity for cruelty and create safeguards to prevent it from happening again. But those safeguards came too late for Albert. Watson proved that fear is learned, but he also proved that some scientists will sacrifice a child's well-being for knowledge and fame. And that's the most disturbing lesson of all. If this experiment disturbed you, you're not alone. Subscribe to Psychology Explained for more deep dives into the most controversial experiments in history. Next, the monster study where researchers gave children speech disorders on purpose. Yes, it's as bad as it sounds.